So the next presentation is on Carl Jung, who established analytic psychology. Um, a little background: Carl Jung was the heir apparent to Freud's psychoanalytic therapy, and for reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes, they had a falling out, and he split off into his own branch. Of course, that would make him a neo-Freudian. So let's talk about analytic psychology. He broke away from the traditional psychoanalysis and rests on the assumption that the occult, that is, the supernatural, can and does influence the lives of everyone. Jung believed that each of us is motivated not only by repressed personal experiences, but also by certain emotionally toned experiences that we inherit from our ancestors. Uh, Needless to say, anthropology and exploration of human cultures was really important for Jung. These inherited images make up what he called, and this is far more important than the personal unconscious, is the collective unconscious. So that collective unconscious includes all those elements that we've never experienced individually, but for which we have come down to us from our ancestors. An interesting and innovative idea. The picture of Carl Jung. Um, This theory includes what are called archetypes, which are the most inclusive archetype is self-realization and can be viewed as a balance between the opposing forces of the personality. So you saw that um, the self-realization was an amalgamation of all the other ones put together. It is a compendium of opposites: introvert, extrovert, rational, irrational, male, female. We'll talk about that one later. Conscious, unconscious, past events, and future expectations. And these are called dialectics. So that's one important thing about Jung, is that he deals in dialectics, which we all do. We can be both a saint and a sinner. We can be a good person and a bad person. We can be supportive and we can be not supportive. So, and part of the process of therapy with Jungian analysis is to come to grips with those dialectics. A little background: he was born in 1875 in Switzerland. He had a super religious upbringing. On his father's side of the family, there were 10 ministers, mostly of Anglican and Presbyterian background. His mother was quite the opposite. She was into the occult, their family was, so he would go to church on Sunday morning and have a seance in the basement on Sunday night. He was the middle of three children. The oldest died after 3 days. His sister was 9 years younger. Incidentally, he experienced early separation from his mother, which became the bedrock of his mother complex. If you study more of Jung, you'll run into that. He became interested in dreams early. He identified at a very young age two distinct personalities in his dreams, although his names for them were pretty mundane: number one and number two. He was interested in archaeology and anthropology as a young student, but then settled on medicine. He experienced many seances as a child. And of course, Freud and his path collided. He trained with many of the same pillars of the industry of the field that Freud did, including Joseph Blauer and Janet, the famous hypnotist. He was the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association and liked Americans and made many trips to the United States. And one of those trips, incidentally, Freud and Jung went together and they decided to analyze each other's dreams. So on the way to the States from Europe, Freud analyzed Jung's dreams, and they were supposed to do the opposite on the way back. Well, on the way there, Jung had revealed in his dreams some homoerotic feelings toward Freud, which upset Jung or Freud deeply. And on the way back, he reneged on his agreement to have his dreams analyzed, which was the thing that led to them never speaking again, either verbally or in writing. So they had a falling out because of that, which only goes to show you that you can't confuse relationships. Don't treat relatives. He was interested in dreams and interpreted Freud's dreams, as I mentioned, on a trip to America. They went their separate ways, and apparently Jung had a mother complex, which is based on his volatile relationship with his mother. This tended to spill over into other relationships, women-centered relationships in his life. And he had multiple relationships with women while he was married, some with and some without the full knowledge of his wife. He had erotic feelings toward Freud, which may have been what terminated their friendship. He experienced sexual assault by an older man when he was very young. Went through a deep period of isolation and searching, which ultimately helped him better understand himself and helped him develop his theories, and incidentally helped him understand other people. He taught medical psychology at the University of Basel in Switzerland and died on June 6, 1961. So unlike, there were different levels of the psyche. Like Freud, he believed that there was both conscious and unconscious levels. Unlike Freud, Jung strongly asserted that the most important part of the unconscious springs not from our personal experience, but from the distant past experiences of all humans, as I mentioned, called the collective unconscious. Of lesser importance are the conscious and the personal unconscious. So the conscious is made up of images that are sensed by our ego. The unconscious elements have no relationship to the ego. Jung's notion of the ego is more restrictive than Freud. For Jung, the ego is not the whole personality. It must be completed by more a comprehensive idea of self. The center of the personality is largely unconscious. In a psychologically healthy person, the ego takes a secondary position to the unconscious self. Consciousness plays a relatively small role in analytic psychology. An overemphasis on expanding one's conscious psyche can lead to psychological imbalances. Healthy individuals are in contact with both the conscious world, but also allow themselves to experience the unconscious self as well. When this happens, the individual achieves what he called individuation. The personal unconscious embraces all repressed, forgotten, and subliminal perceived experiences from one particular individual, yourself. The personal unconscious is similar to Freud's view of the unconscious and other preconscious combined. The content of the personal unconscious are called complexes. These are emotionally toned conglomerations of associated ideas like mother, for example. Complexes may be partly conscious and may stem from both personal and collective unconscious. What's really important is the collective unconscious. It has roots deep in ancestral past and of the entire species. So it's not just you, but many people that have gone before you. These include distant ancestors' experience with universal concepts like God and Mother and water and earth are transmitted through the generations so that people in every time have been influenced by their primitive ancestors' primordial experiences. The content of the collective unconscious are the same, more or less, for people in every culture. And this is evident, for example, in dreams. People all around the globe have the same types of dreams. They influence people's myths, their legends, and religions. Just the whole idea that there is a God is transcultural. It is the human innate tendency to react in a particular way whenever these experiences stimulate the biologically inherited response tendencies like mothers' unlearned or unlikely response of love toward their newborn. Initial contact with these images are forms without content, but with practice the content emerges and becomes relatively autonomous images called archetypes. So archetypes are ancient or archaic images that derive from the collective unconscious. Sometimes it's likened to like a cosmic placenta that all 12 billion people in the history of the world are connected to, at least psychologically. They're similar to, in that they are emotionally toned collections of associated images, and while complexes are individual components of the personal unconscious, archetypes are generalized and derived from the content of the collective unconscious. The potential for countless numbers of archetypes exists within each person, and when a personal experience corresponds to the latent primordial image, the archetype becomes activated. Archetypes are expressed indirectly, and when activated, it expresses itself through dreams, fantasies, and delusions. But of course, dreams are the main source of archetypal material and offered what Jung considered proof for the existence of archetypes. Dreams are motifs that could not have been known to the dreamer through personal experience. And so, as you probably have already guessed, Jungian analysis focuses heavily on dream interpretation. These are some examples, including the hero, um, like Frodo Baggins, the sidekick, like Luke, Han Solo, the maiden, like Leia, the wild child, or wise old man, like Gandalf, the dream mother, like Galadriel, the eternal child, like uh, R2D2, the villain, the shapeshifter, like Gollum, and the trickster, like the two other hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. I'm sure you can come up with more. These are just examples. So what are some of the archetypes? Well, one's called the persona, which is the side of the personality that you show to the world. Uh, Not necessarily the same public face that you show to others, but what you perceive to be you in relation to others. Jung believed that to be psychologically healthy, one must strike a balance between the demands of society and what we really are. To be oblivious to one's persona is to underestimate the importance of society, but to be unaware of the person's individuality is to become society's puppet. So this is something that we're always grappling with, the persona, what we present to people. The part we don't present to people is called the shadow. And this archetype of darkness and repression represented by the qualities that we do not wish to acknowledge but attempt to hide from ourselves and from other people. The shadow consists of morally objectionable tendencies as well as a number of constructive qualities that we are reluctant to face. We must continually strive to know our shadow, and this is our first test of courage. Courage is a theme that follows into Adler, which we'll talk about next. It's easier to project the dark side onto others that we refuse to see in ourselves. To come to grips with the darkness within ourselves is to activate the realization that the shadow of the shadow. Most of us never realize our shadow, and this leads to tragedy in our lives and feelings of defeat and discouragement. So an example of a way you might come to grips with that is as a person might in Alcoholics Anonymous, where they come to grips with the fact that they have a problem. And if you know anyone who's gone into recovery, that's usually the biggest and most difficult step. It is a test of courage. So you can see how this is a dialectic between the shadow and the persona. One's open and one's not open. The anima and the animus are the female and the male counterparts to our personality, respectively. So it's the feminine side of men that originates in the collective unconscious as an archetype and remains extremely resistant to consciousness. Few men become well acquainted with their anima because this task requires great courage, and it's even more difficult to become acquainted than with their shadow. To master the projection of the anima, men must overcome intellectual barriers, delve into far reaches of their unconscious, and realize that their feminine side of their personality even exists. Jung believes that the anima originated from men's early experiences with women, including mothers, sisters, and lovers, which combine into this archetypal concept of women. At times, the archetype of the anima is an image, and other times it's represented in a feeling or a mood. The animus, on the other hand, is the masculine side of women and originates in the collective unconscious as an archetype that, too, is resistant to consciousness. The animus is a symbolic of thinking and reasoning, and is capable of influence thinking of women, and yet it does not belong to her. It belongs to the collective unconscious and originates from the encounters of prehistoric women with men. The animus originates from early women's experiences with men, including fathers and brothers and lovers, and are combined into this archetypal concept of men. Both the anima and the animus can influence the relationships of men and women with partners. The animus appears in dreams, visions, and fantasies in a personified form. Great Mother is another archetype that's derived from both the anima and the animus. Every man and woman possess a Great Mother archetype. The pre-existing concept of mother has both positive and negative feelings which extend to this archetype. The Great Mother represents the opposing forces of fertility and nourishment on the one hand, and power and destruction on the other. It's also known as Grandmother, Mother of God, Mother Nature, Mother Earth, the stepmother, and even a witch. Fertility and power combine to form a concept of rebirth, which itself may be a different archetype altogether. Rebirth is represented in the process of reincarnation, baptism, resurrection, and even individuation. The wise old man is derived from the anima and the animus as well. This archetype is representative of wisdom and meaning, and symbolizes humans' pre-existing knowledge of the mysteries of life. This archetype is unconscious and cannot be directly experienced by the individual. Instead, the collective unconscious cannot directly impart its wisdom to an individual, so the wise old man is personified in dreams as fathers, grandfathers, teachers, philosophers, gurus, doctors, priests, maybe even professors. It can be a king, a sage, or even a magician, and it takes in both tales and stories. The hero archetype is represented in mythology and legend as a powerful person, sometimes part god, and one who fights evil. Heroes are always mortal because an immortal person has no weakness and cannot be a hero. The image of a hero touches an archetype within us that demonstrates our fascination with heroes in movies, novels, plays, and television. When the hero conquers the villain, he or she frees us from the feelings of impotence and misery. At the same time, the hero serves as the model for the ideal personality. The self is the most powerful archetype. Jung believed that each person possessed an inherited tendency to move toward growth, perfection, and completion, and he called this innate disposition the self. The most comprehensive of all archetypes of self is the archetype of archetypes, because it pulls together many archetypes and unites them in a process of self-realization, which we talked about earlier. The dynamics of the personality are important. Jung insisted that human behavior is shaped by both causal and teleological forces. Teleological, by the way, means future-oriented, and that causal explanations must be balanced with teleological ones. Adaptation to the outside world involves a forward flow of the psychic energy called progress, while adaptation to the inner world relies on backward flow of psychic energy called regression. Progression inclines a person to react consistently to a given set of environmental conditions, whereas regression is necessarily a backward step in a successful attainment of a goal. The balance of both regression and progression leads to healthy personality development. So we're not only are we moving backwards sometimes, but unlike Freud, we're moving forwards or into these teleological forces. There were something that came out of Jung's work were different psychological types. He's the first person to actually talk about that. The various psychological growth types um, out of the union of two basic attitudes, introversion and extroversion, and four separate functions, including thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. So the attitudes are self-explanatory. It's a predisposition to act or react in a characteristic manner. Introversion is a turning inward. Extroversion is a turning outward. And people are neither one or the other, but a balance of both. Functions include sensing, telling people that something exists, um, thinking, enabling us to recognize its meaning, feeling, telling us its value or worth, and intuiting, allowing them to know about it without knowing how they know. It's kind of that sixth sense. Incidentally, from the psychological types uh, came some important psychological tests, not the least of which is called the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, the MBTI. So importantly, like with Freud, um, Jung was interested in the emphasis on the development of the personality. Unlike Freud, he emphasized the second half of life, not the first half. So the person can bring together various aspects of life to gain self-realization. So, and he likened life to like a diurnal cycle of day and night. In the early morning, our lives during childhood are full of potential, but we lack consciousness. We feel disconnected islands of consciousness, primitive images of consciousness. We develop some ego, some logical and verbal thinking, but we're largely still disconnected. The ego goes from subjective to objective and refer to themselves in the first person. You don't need to know those phases, but you do need to know that not much is going on in terms of what Jung thought about childhood because of our lack of consciousness. As the day progresses to youth or the morning sun, we're climbing toward our zenith, which is the high point in the day. Young people strive to gain psychic and physical independence from their parents. They find a mate, they raise a family, they make a place in the world. Middle-aged people that attempt to hold on to youthful values face a crippling second half of life. Unable to self-realize and to establish new goals, they seek out new meaning in life. Midlife is next, and of course, it's a brilliant late morning sun heading toward sunset. Begins about age 35 to 40 and is filled with much anxiety and periods of tremendous potential. You discover new meaning in life and often have new religious orientations or deal with life and death, like the loss of parents. In old age, the evening sun occurs, and at once bright, conscious now marked by dim light. There's the fear of death, and of course, the meaning of death. It varies from one person to the next. So in terms of self-realization, analytical psychology is essentially a psychology of opposites. And a realization is the process of integrating the opposite poles from single homogeneous individual. This process of coming to selfhood means that the person has all the psychological components functioning in unity with no psychic process atrophying. People who have gone through this process have achieved realization of the self, minimized their persona, recognized their anima and animus, and acquired a workable balance between introversion and extroversion. In addition, the self-realized individual have lifted all four of their functions to a superior position, an extremely difficult accomplishment for any human to do. In terms of psychotherapy, wrapping this up, Jung would do especially word association tests. So he would say a word and you would respond to it with whatever came to your mind. But his real claim to fame was dream analysis. Um, this is where complexes and archetypes could be realized. And he thought, as I mentioned earlier, that this was proof of the collective unconscious. He encouraged people to do active imagination, requiring a person to begin with an impression like a dream, an image, a vision, a picture, a fantasy, and to concentrate on it until the impression began to move. Follow the image, try to communicate with it no matter where this goes. This, by the way, is something he did during his dream analysis too. So he would have an individual put pieces or toys into a sandbox and then have them have active conversations with the different parts in the dream or in the sandbox. He also encouraged lucid dreaming to try to shape your dreams. Psychotherapy came in 4 basic approaches. First, to confess to a pathological agent, I have a problem. Second, to interpret it, explain, and elucidate or gain an insight into the problem. Third was to educate the patient, as a social being, how he's connected to other people. And fourth, to transform the patient into a healthy human. So analysis with Jung could take many, many years, just like it did with Freud. And that's wrap it up with Jung.